Right, so the chapter we'll be considering this evening is 1 Samuel 19, and in my Bible at least that's headed Saul persecutes David, but when I was reading through it I found that the events described in it aren't what I typically thought of when I thought of Saul persecuting David. I believe they'll be covered later on this year in future Bible classes, so I won't go into too much detail of those tonight. What I will be doing is I'll start off with some of the background to this chapter, looking at basically the lives of Saul and David, and to a lesser degree Jonathan and Saul's daughter Michal. I'll then move on to looking in a bit more detail at chapter 19, which I've broken into three parts. There's the first 7 verses which really encapsulate the kind of affairs between Jonathan, David and Saul in a kind of microcosm of what was to happen throughout their lives. The centre part of the chapter from verses 10 down to about verse 17 describe a particular incident where Saul sent messengers, or more likely soldiers, to David and Michal's house with the express intention of killing David. We'll look a bit more at what happened then and a bit more consideration of what was involved in that. And then the third part of the chapters from verse 18 to the end, where David flees to Naioth, where the prophet Samuel was living, and we have the incident recorded where Saul sends yet more messengers, 3 groups of them, and they all get taken by the influence of the Spirit and end up, as it says, at least in my record, prophesying. And ultimately Saul himself goes there, and the same occurs to him. So we'll spend a bit of time looking at that. It wouldn't be a talk about David without some consideration of the Psalms that he wrote. There's one in particular that's, as far as I can see at least, written at this time, inspired very much by this event. So I'll spend some time looking at that. It's Psalm 59, and then I'll finish just with a few parallels or thoughts on the interaction between Saul and David, and how that parallels with the interaction of the Jews and the early believers in Christ. So in terms of background, the story of Saul and David really starts in 1 Samuel 12 when Saul's crowned by Samuel. Even at that time, it's recorded that God isn't pleased with the choice of Saul as a king, and as much as anything it's because that represents Israel rejecting him as leader over them and choosing a king like all the nations around them. After 2 years, we read in 1 Samuel 13 that Saul disobeys God. He doesn't wait for Samuel to return from wherever he was, and he offers the unlawful sacrifice. At that point, he's told that someone else will reign instead, but no more details given as to who it would be. 1 Samuel 14, we see the ongoing conflict between Israel and the Philistines, and there's a particular record of Jonathan having success in battle against the Philistines. God properly rejects Saul in 1 Samuel 15 after his next act of disobedience, where instead of totally wiping out Agag and the Amalekites, he disobeys, and the children of Israel keep a large number of them alive and a lot of the spoil. Samuel, again, at that time tells Saul in no uncertain terms that someone else is going to reign. In 1 Samuel 16, David's then anointed, and And by turn of events, God causes David to end up in the court of Saul, actually soothing not an unclean spirit, a distressing spirit that comes on Saul. David's talent as a musician is called upon to calm Saul down. In chapter 17 we have the well-known incident of David and Goliath, but it's notable that at the end of that episode, David still hasn't fully registered with Saul, in that at the end of the chapter Saul actually asks, "Who is David?" and Abner has to tell him that he's David, he's the son of Jesse. And moving closer to our chapter tonight, in chapter 18, it starts off with David and Jonathan becoming close companions, and a covenant of some sorts made between them. At this point, Saul gets wind of David because the people start acknowledging that he's a mighty warrior, and they're acclaiming him more than Saul. And as a result of this, Saul decides to keep David where he can keep an eye on him, and he ends up in the court of Saul, living very close to him. At this point, Saul decides that it would be beneficial to have David as a son-in-law, and at the end of chapter 18 we have the incident where David ends up marrying Michal. It's worth spending a minute or two just going over the background of that, because it's not something I'd really picked up on before, that Saul originally offered his eldest daughter Merab to David as a wife, but for reasons known to Saul, she was actually given to Adriel the Maholathite as a wife instead. It's then recorded that Michal actually loved David, she cared a lot about him, so Saul decides to make use of this, and once again he makes the offer to David of, "Marry my daughter, become the king's son-in-law." When David accepted that offer, he basically said, "I'm a poor man, what dowry can I give you?" Saul, seeing an opportunity to potentially kill David, says, "You just have to kill 100 Philistines for me and bring me the proof." David goes out and kills double the number, and Saul then has no option but to give him his daughter Michal as a wife. Saul obviously wanted to use Michal against David, and as we'll see in a bit, Michal's affection towards David caused Saul to actually hate David even more. So as we come to the start of chapter 19, we find that David's got Saul as his father-in-law, rapidly turning into his fiercest enemy, knowing that David would one day succeed Saul as king. Saul, as we've seen, hates him for being more popular as a leader of the people than he is, and he's looking to kill him. He's got his closest companion in Jonathan, who's Saul's son. His wife is Saul's daughter, and he's also, by reason of circumstance, living extremely close to where Saul had his base, as we'll see a bit later. So even at the start of this chapter, we can see that his faith and his trust in God must already be very clear, and it's actively directing his life. So if we come on to the chapter, and the first part of the chapter, where we've got David, Saul and Jonathan continuing their interactions. So in verse 1, Saul spoke to Jonathan, his son, and to all his servants that they should kill David. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted greatly in David. So Jonathan told David, saying, "My father seeks to kill you. Therefore, please be on your guard until morning, and stay in a secret place and hide. I will go out and stand beside my father in the field where you are, and I will speak with my father about you. Then what I observe I will tell you." So really, this is the first time recorded that David is actively being hunted directly by Saul and his subjects. Previously, Saul's used or tried to use circumstance to kill David. He's now gone a stage further and is using direct action. At this stage, it's quite likely, as far as I can see, that he doesn't know fully that David's anointed by God as his successor. Not that it would have made any difference in Saul's mind, given his disregard for God, as we've previously seen earlier in his life. So in verses 2 and 3, Jonathan actually shows more loyalty to David than his father, and tells him what Saul's planning to do, and basically says he would act as a mediator. It's clear that Jonathan and David had made some sort of covenant, recorded in chapter 18, the first few verses, and that as a result of that, Jonathan was no longer loyal to Saul as his natural family, but he was actually closer to David. And that again is very much in evidence in chapter 20, which centres around David, Jonathan and Saul there, where again David hides from Saul and Jonathan does as much as he can to stop Saul from killing him. So in verses 4 to 6 of 1 Samuel 19, we find that Saul manages to act as a mediator, and he talks Saul round from killing David. And at this point, Jonathan manages to appeal to Saul's moral compass and say to him, why are you sinning against David? What has he done against you? Why do you want to do this? And Saul even takes an oath that David wouldn't be killed. This may not have... Well, this may actually have shown how little concern Saul had for God, given that by verse 10 of the chapter, only a fairly short time afterwards, this oath had been broken. And the consequences of taking that oath under the law were a lot more severe than Saul may have thought they would have been. Verses 7 to 10 really encapsulate the time period, and they're just a repeat of what's previously happened. So in verse 7 we see David returning before Saul. He's actually brought back before Saul by Jonathan, but it's much the same as seen in chapter 16, where he's brought before Saul to minister before him. In verse 8 we've then got another record of David going out fighting the Philistines and as it says, striking them with the mighty blow so that they fled from him, which is again a repeat of what happened in chapter 17. And then in verse 9 we see the distressing spirit from the Lord coming upon Saul, and David's brought before him to play music to comfort him. So as we saw in chapter 16 and 18, Saul gets the distressing spirit from the Lord, and his arch enemy David ends up being the one who comforts him, at least in the short term. I suspect the longer term effects on Saul of that would not have been positive. And then in verse 10 we have the second record of Saul trying to pin David to the wall with a spear, and once again, as happened in chapter 18, David manages to escape and flees from Saul's presence. Given that this appears to be a cyclic kind of set of events, very similar to the cycle recorded in the Judges, I kind of think that this is actually God giving Saul an opportunity to reconsider his ways. He's put David in front of him to show him a man after God's own heart, and he's giving Saul an opportunity to change his ways and repent. But as we've seen, Saul directly tries to kill David on 2 occasions, in chapters 18 and 19, and it bears comparison and stark contrast between the two occasions that David could easily have killed Saul. Those are recorded in chapter 24, when David was hidden in a cave. Saul came in to relieve himself and could easily have been killed, but David chose not to. And then in chapter 26, we have the occasion recorded where David goes into the camp of the Philistines, could easily have killed Saul in the night, but instead he takes Saul's water jug and his spear and then confronts Saul from some distance away, saying, "I could have killed you, but I haven't. Why are you hounding me into the ground?" So just from this we can see that David respected Saul as the Lord's anointed, but Saul either wasn't aware, or certainly later in his life didn't recognise David and respect him the same way. And that, if nothing else, demonstrates David's faith in God, because he had the opportunity to kill Saul himself and take the throne that way, but he always chose not to lift up his hand against someone who God had chosen, and he chose to allow events to take their natural course as directed by God. So, moving on to the events in the middle of the chapter, where David escapes from Saul with some help and support from Michael. We see in chapter 10 verse 10, that David fled and escaped from Saul that night, and Saul also sent messengers to David's house to watch him and to kill him in the morning. Michael, David's wife, told him, saying, "If you do not save your life tonight, tomorrow you will be killed." So Michael let David down through a window, and he went and fled and escaped. So at this point, David goes to his marital home, and his wife makes him aware that Saul has sent messengers to kill him. Just from this incident, I can see clear similarities with 3 other incidents recorded through the scriptures. Those are when the spies escaped from Jericho by hiding in Rahab's house. There's a parallel with Samson and Delilah, where the Philistines again waited for Samson, waited all night for him with the intention of killing him in the morning. And also Paul, just after his conversion, escaped from Damascus by being let down over a wall in a basket. So it's a form of escape that's seen more than once through the scriptures. Of course, the question bears asking, why didn't the messengers just force their way into the house and take David? And one idea I came across on that is that in those times, women's quarters, or as one explanation had it, their harem, their areas, their quarters, their living area, were viewed as very much sacred and off limits to uninvited intruders. So initially the messengers from Saul wouldn't have had justification for forcing entry. It seems that this was key to David's escape, and that the messengers' reluctance to force entry and kill him immediately bought him some extra time and allowed him to escape. And then from verse 13 onwards, we see Michael's attempt to cover David's escape. As we read earlier, this involved an image in verse 13, or as the root word is, it's a teraphim, or a household idol, which was put into the bed where David should have been sleeping, and then disguised in a fairly crude way. it does raise the question of how the idols came to be in the household. It's almost certain that they were brought in by Michael rather than David, and that got me thinking, could this actually have been another part of Saul's motive to allow David to marry Michael, given that she would have been in a position possibly to turn him away from God to worshipping idols. In 1 Samuel 18 verse 21, when he's thinking about giving David to Michael, Saul says, "I will give her to him, that she may be a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him." So Saul was clearly looking for ways to snare him, and if he knew that Michael had idolatrous tendencies, or she'd been brought up in an idolatrous house, that may have been another way that Saul was thinking, I can use this, I can turn him away from God, and once I've done that, I can kill him. So one thing that is notable, just going back to the images, is that they certainly appear to have grown in size from Jacob's time. It's the well-known incident in Genesis 31 where Jacob leaves Laban, takes Rachel and all of his family with him, and unknown to him, Rachel's taken Laban's household idols. When Laban catches up with him, he searches all of Jacob's camp, and finally he ends up at the tent of Rachel, but she's actually sitting on the household images, which to me at least implies that the ones that Rachel stole were significantly smaller than the image that Michael used to aid David's escape. What was this increase in size of the image reflecting an increased prominence, or as is often the case, some kind of one-upmanship in terms of idol worship? Either way, it was still a key part in David's escape. So back in chapter 19, after David's escaped, there's a confrontation in verse 17 between Michael and Saul. Like Jonathan, Michael is now more loyal to David than she is to her father, even though Saul at this stage clearly expects her loyalty to lie with him. As Saul says, "Why have you deceived me like this and sent my enemy away so that he has escaped?" And Michael's response is to basically say, "He said to me, 'Let me go, why should I kill you?'" These words, "Why should I kill you?" occur, as far as I can see, one other time in the record of the Kings, and that's in 2 Samuel chapter 2. It's the incident where Asahel and Abner are pursuing each other. I'm sorry, I've got the wrong reference there.
2 Samuel 2:22.
Say again, sorry?
2 Samuel 2:22.
Ah, yes. Yeah. Thanks, Ron. Thanks, Don. So as we see there, Abner catches up with Asahel. Asahel catches up with Abner, and Abner then says to Asahel, "Turn aside from following me. Why should I strike you to the ground? How could I then face your brother Joab?" And it's that final thing that he says of "how could I then face your brother Joab" that got me thinking, was David's covenant with Jonathan in fact extended to also include not striking Michael down or any of Saul's other households? It may well have been that David did not want to have to face Jonathan having done any kind of harm to Michael in facilitating his escape. I've got no definite proof of that from the record of the covenant between Jonathan and David, but it certainly seems to fit. Right. So, just briefly, later on in the life of Michael and David, given that it follows on, in 1 Samuel 25, we have the record of David taking Abigail and Ahinoam as two more wives. He doesn't seem to have any kind of issues in doing this. Certainly at the time, the custom seemed to be for men to have more than one wife, and that didn't seem to be an issue to him. It also didn't seem to be an issue for Saul to then give Michal, who was David's wife, to Paltiel, as is recorded in 1 Samuel 25. However, it's kind of telling that in 2 Samuel 3, after he's anointed, David, one of the first things he does is he sends messengers to retake Michal as his wife. And from the record in 2 Samuel 3, we can see that this caused some distress to her husband Paltiel, but David's men basically gave him no choice of go home or face the consequences. In 2 Samuel 6, David's relationship with Michal's effectively ended when, after the incident where the ark was brought back to Jerusalem, Michal criticised David for the way he was dancing and celebrating the return of the ark. Whether this was just as a result of that lack of respect, or also a kind of cumulative effect, including previous loyalty to other gods, isn't necessarily clear. But certainly after that point, David says that he would never have children by her. But that in some ways was probably recognition of God's plan, given that David, having children by Saul's descendants, would have made his later life even more complicated with family relations than it already was. So we can see from that incident that it was clear that Michal loved David more than Saul, even though she didn't fully follow God, if she did at all, and Saul was clearly trying to use this against David. However, even Michal's idolatry was then used to allow David to escape, and once again he managed to do that. And as we see from verse 18 of the chapter 19, David flees and takes refuge with Samuel at Ramah, and we then have the incident recorded of Saul and the prophets. So as we can see, or as is shown in the previous chapter, Samuel's home was in Ramah, and in verse 18, when he was being pursued by Saul's men, David clearly saw it as a place of refuge and safety. It was actually only a few miles at most from Gibeah, where Saul had his house and where he ruled from. And in verse 19 it was told Saul, saying, "Take note, David is at Naioth in Ramah." This would actually have told Saul that David was within 2 or 3 miles of him, and effectively could have been taken at almost any time. So we see the almost inevitable events in verse 20, where Saul sends messengers to take David. And it's highly likely that these were either the same bunch of soldiers as were sent in verse 10, or a very similar group but with even stronger orders to make sure they got him. But what then happens is a repeat of of what happened to Saul directly just before he was crowned in 1 Samuel 10. If you come to 1 Samuel 10, I'll read verses 5 and 6, and then verses 9 to 11. So as he's going up to Bethel, he's told that after that you shall come to the hill of God, where the Philistine garrison is. It will happen, when you have come there to the city, that you will meet a group of prophets coming down from the high place with a stringed instrument, a tambourine, a flute, a harp before them, and they will be prophesying. Then the Spirit of the Lord will come upon you, and you will prophesy with them, and be turned into another man. On to verse 9. So it was, when he had turned his back to go from Samuel, that God gave him another heart, and all those signs came to pass that day. When they came there to the hill, there was a group of prophets to meet him. Then the Spirit of God came upon him, and he prophesied among them. And it happened, when all who knew him formerly saw that he indeed prophesied among the prophets, that the people said to one another, "What is this that has come upon the son of Kish? Is Saul also among the prophets?" So, as we've read in chapter 19, Saul sends messengers to take David, and they are, as they come to Naioth, where Samuel is, and the group of prophets, Saul's messengers are taken by the Spirit of God, and they end up prophesying. And Saul sends another two groups, the same thing happens, and eventually Saul decides that enough's enough, he's had enough of this going backwards and forwards, and he's going to go himself. Time span for that, it's possible that it could have happened within a day, but a few days at most. I actually think it makes more sense for it to be within the space of one day, given the close proximity of Ramah and Gibeah. However, in comparison with chapter 10, it certainly appears to be Samuel and the same group of prophets from verse 10 of chapter 10. It's the same action of the Spirit of the Lord, and the same outcome of the affected individuals prophesying and the onlookers wondering what's going on and saying, "Is Saul also among the prophets?" Which was clearly not something they expected to see. He'd obviously developed enough of a reputation that being associated with the prophets of God was a surprise for people. It seems strange to me that Saul didn't remember the previous occasion. I'd be very surprised if he didn't remember something like that, particularly given what followed it. And to my mind, this is yet another illustration that God wasn't willing even for Saul to perish, and he was giving him another reminder and another opportunity to repent. Another question that came to my mind when they're described as prophesying, to my mind it didn't make sense for the readily accepted meaning of the verb to prophesy, i.e. telling future events, to be happening to several groups of people at the same time. Looking at the Hebrew root word, which was naba, which is also translated to speak or sing by inspiration, then from a concordance, that's either in prediction or simple discourse under inspiration. In this case, the latter seems a bit more likely, in that they were inspired to speak whatever God put in their mouths, rather than predicting events which would have had to have been fairly immediately fulfilled for them to be recognised as prophets. That, to me, makes more sense than saying that they were foretelling some future occurrences. If there's any comment or any correction on that, I'd be glad to hear it. So, So, as we've seen both times, the people surrounding Samuel weren't expecting to see Saul with the prophets at all. It's very clear in both in 1 Samuel 10 and this chapter that Saul being among the prophets was sufficiently noteworthy for it to even be turned into a proverb. And as is recorded, the people were saying, is Saul also among the prophets? And that ended up used as a proverb throughout Israel. So we're coming towards the end of what I've got to say, but there is one psalm in particular, Psalm 59, that certainly appears to have been written at the time of these events, where David's being hunted by Saul's men. Could I ask you to read that for us, please, Tim?
So reading with you from the book of Psalms 59. To the chief musician Altasketh, Miktam of David, when Saul sent, and they watched the house to kill him. Deliver me from mine enemies, O my God. Defend me from them that rise up against me. Deliver me from the workers of iniquity, and save me from the bloody men. For, lo, they lie in wait for my soul. The mighty are gathered against me. Not for my transgression, not for my sin, O Yahweh. They run and prepare themselves without my fault. Awake to help me, and behold. Thou therefore, O Yahweh, God of hosts, the God of Israel, awake to visit all the heathen. Be not merciful to any wicked transgressors. Selah. They return at evening. They make a noise like a dog, and go round about the city. Behold, they belch out with their mouth. Swords are in their lips, for who, say they, doth hear? But thou, O Yahweh, shalt laugh at them. Thou shalt have all the heathen in derision. Because of his strength will I wait upon thee, for God is my defence. The God of my mercy shall prevent me. God shall let me see my desire upon mine enemies. Slay them not, lest my people forget. Scatter them by thy power, and bring them down, O Lord our shield. For the sin of their mouth and the words of their lips, let them even be taken in their pride, and for cursing and lying which they speak. Consume them in wrath, consume them, that they may not be. And let them know that God ruleth in Jacob unto the ends of the earth. Selah. And at evening let them return, and let them make a noise like a dog, and go round about the city. Let them wander up and down for meat, and grudge if they be not satisfied. But I will sing of thy power. Yea, I will sing aloud of thy mercy in the morning. For thou hast been my defence and refuge in the day of my trouble. Unto thee, O my strength, will I sing. For God is my defence and the God of my mercy.
Thank you, Tim. So, like many psalms, this psalm alternates between two key themes that occur regularly in David's writings, namely the deliverance from oppression that we see in verses 1 to 4, 6 to 7, and then 11 to 15. And that's interleaved with praise and thanks to God and extolling the power of God in verse 5, verses 8 to 10, then 12 and 16 through 17. It's noticeable that 6 to 10 and 14 to 17 repeat the same idea of at evening they return, they growl like a dog and go up all around the city. Indeed, they belch with their mouth, swords are in their lips, for they say, who hears? Or in verse 15, they wander up and down for food and howl if they are not satisfied. which is clearly David's portrayal of the people trying to kill him as savage dogs, acting very much on animal instinct and hunting for food and as it says, howling if they're not satisfied. Whereas in verses 8 to 10 and 16 to 17, it's very much a statement of God's deliverance. And one thing I did notice was that in verse 9, David says, "I will wait for you, O you his strength, for God is my defence." Whereas in verse 16 and 17, David's saying, you'll note the change of tense here, "But I will sing of your power, yes, I will sing aloud of your mercy in the morning. For you have been my defence and refuge in the day of my trouble. To you, O my strength, I will sing praises, for God is my defence, my God of mercy." So, to me at least, that possibly gives an indication of when the different parts of this psalm were written, in the first part of the psalm, David's very much saying, God is my defence and God will deliver me, but by the end it's changed to God has been my defence and he has been my refuge in the day of trouble. So it's almost as if the first half of the psalm was written, or at least the idea came from the time when he was in his own house and Saul's men were surrounding the house, and the second half perhaps penned in Samuel's presence in Ramah. An alternative possibly for the change in tense is more that it's a restatement and a boosting of his own confidence that God has previously delivered him, because as we know from the David and Goliath incident, David had already depended on God to fight bears, lions and various other wild animals while keeping sheep. However, either way, it's very much expressing David's trust in God. It's worth spending a couple of minutes looking at verse 11 through to 13, which have a slightly different tone, more expressing David's wish for God to work the situation through. So, verse 11, "Do not slay them, lest my people forget. Scatter them by your power, and bring them down, O Lord our shield. For the sin of their mouth and the words of their lips, let them even be taken in their pride, and for the cursing and lying which they speak. Consume them in wrath, consume them that they may not be, and let them know that God rules in Jacob to the ends of the earth." So this is David perhaps venting his inner desires for what he wanted to happen to his people, but he's very much saying it's over to God to do what he wanted to. To me it seems that these requests were partly answered by the events that we've seen in 1 Samuel 19, where an incident happened that would have been remembered for quite some time, which ties in with the "do not slay them lest my people forget, scatter them by your power." So it was very much God's power that brought confusion on Saul's plan. It was remembered for quite some time. It did show God's control in the kingdoms of men, and it's certainly possible that the rest of that was fulfilled by Solomon when he carried out the scattering and destruction of Saul's family. Even by doing this, though, David didn't raise his hand against Saul or any of his descendants. And as we've already said a few times, "Is Saul among the prophets" became a proverb in Israel, so that the incident would have remained in the people's recollection for at least a generation or two. And it's also worth noting very much in passing, verse 13, David's desire that the people may know that God rules in Jacob to the ends of the earth. So it wasn't just deliverance. It was still very much making sure that the people knew of God and ultimately would fear him. So finally, just a few parallels between Saul and David, some similarities between what happened with them and what happened with Christ, the first century Jews and the early church. Saul and the Jews were both chosen by God, the Jews back in Deuteronomy and Saul as king in 1 Samuel 9, but neither were chosen for their loyalty to God. It was very much a case of God made the selection on both occasions rather than any particular appealing characteristics that made God choose them. As we've seen, Saul disobeyed God, so God rejected him, and the Jews repeatedly disobeyed God, and eventually God exiled them, and both Saul and the Jews were replaced by, for want of a better word, more worthy parties. David replaced Saul as king, and the Christian believers became key to God's plan. Saul realised that God had chosen David in 1 Samuel 24 verse 20, where he says, sorry, it's 1 Samuel 24 verse 20. Saul says to David, "And now I know indeed that you shall surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand." So that seems to be the point where Saul actually realises David's going to succeed him. At the time of Christ and the apostles, the Jews get the message of Gentile salvation. For example, in Acts 13 verse 46, so Acts 13 verse 46, we have, Paul and Barnabas grew bold and said, "It was necessary that the word of God should be spoken to you first. But since you reject it and judge yourselves unworthy of everlasting life, behold, we turn to the Gentiles." So that we can clearly see both Saul, so both Saul and the Jews were rejected by the parties trying to turn them back to God, and both Saul and the Jews reacted badly to that realisation. The record in 1 Samuel records repeatedly how Saul tried to eliminate David as a threat to his rulership, and we know from the Acts that the Jews persecuted the early church, and of course in the Gospels they put Christ to death. However, both the efforts of Saul and the Jews were ultimately futile in that David became king and Jesus was resurrected and the early church flourished. And the basis of our hope is the ultimate parallel of this that's still to be fulfilled when Christ returns to set up the kingdom of God. So we've seen, I hope, David's integrity as a man after God's own heart. He was very much loyal to Jonathan and to Michael, and he also inspired loyalty in those around him, whereas Saul was a self-seeking person rejected by God. David always trusted God, even in the presence of the people who wanted to kill him, and he ultimately received what he'd been promised, which is a clear example for us, rather than the example of Saul, who got what was promised him as a result of his actions. So, thank you very much.